They say blood is thicker than water, but apparently a $4 million life insurance policy is thicker than both. My family tried to drown me for my inheritance, but they forgot one major detail. I know how to swim. If you came here to see a greedy, backstabbing family get absolutely dismantled by a powerhouse lawyer and a woman who refuses to die, you are definitely in the right place. My stepmother didn't just pack a lunch for our yacht trip that morning. She curated a high-end picnic designed to celebrate my demise. We're talking 2 chilled bottles of vintage Veuve Clicquot, an artisanal wheel of brie, and a jar of those fancy olives she literally had overnighted from a gourmet spot in Connecticut. But nestled right next to the pricey cheese was the real masterpiece, a change of beneficiary form she'd had notarized behind my back just the week prior. Talk about cold-blooded. We pulled out of the marina right at noon, the powerful engines hummin'. My stepsister, Chloe, planted herself on the bow, oversized sunglasses on, refusing to make eye contact with me for the entire first hour. It was one of those deceptively perfect days on the water, flat as a pancake, shimmering green and a balmy 74 degrees. A beautiful day for a murder. By 7 p.m. that evening, I wasn't on the boat anymore. I was in that water. Welcome back to real Reddit revenge, where the pettiest villains meet their match, and quiet women with powerhouse lawyers always get the absolute last word. If you haven't officially joined the family yet, go ahead and smash that subscribe button right now and hammer that notification bell, because trust me, you do not want to miss how this one unravels. It is worth staying for. Now, let me fill you in on exactly what went down. To understand how we ended up on that boat, you have to understand the cooler. The very first time Candace packed that iconic cooler, my father was still alive. My dad, Arthur Vance, was a simple, hard-working guy despite his success. He'd bought that rugged red canvas cooler with the heavy brass buckles back in '97, the same year he finally added a second tugboat to his small, burgeoning fleet. Empty, the thing weighed probably 8 pounds, it was a beast, but he loved it. He used to cram it filled to the brim with homemade ham sandwiches and old-school root beer, taking it on every single run he made from the main dock out to whatever massive cargo vessel needed his inspection that week. When Candace sashayed into our lives, she immediately started upgrading things. Suddenly, the hearty ham was replaced with imported prosciutto, and the root beer became fancy sparkling water or Prosecco. My dad, he just smiled and rolled with it. He loved her, and honestly, he was too chill to think the contents of a cooler were worth having an argument over. My father built a massive maritime logistics empire from essentially nothing, just one beat-up tugboat and a borrowed slip at the municipal dock. By the time I hit 12, Arthur Vance's company was managing the cargo routing for literally half of all the commercial sea traffic on the eastern seaboard below Norfolk. We went from scraping by to being comfortable, then rich. By the time I turned 18, we had moved into the dream house on Breer Point. It was gorgeous. White clapboard siding, a massive wraparound porch, and a perfect visual of the harbor where his tugs and barges came and went all day long. But all that success came at a cost. My mother passed away when I was 11. Ovarian cancer. It was aggressive. She was gone in just 14 months. My father spent the next 7 years raising me by himself, which meant I didn't have a normal childhood. I grew up on grimy docks, in the wheelhouses of roaring tugboats, and sitting in the back row of stuffy maritime arbitration hearings. I literally learned algebra while high-priced lawyers argued over cargo insurance and demurrage fees. He finally married Candace when I was 18. She was this polished event planner from Bridgeport who had organized a huge fundraiser for the harbor master's retirement, which is how they met. She was 40 at the time, well-dressed, smooth in conversation, and she had this almost magical ability to walk into a room and make every single person there feel like they were the guest of honor. My dad, who spent 30 years shooting the breeze with longshoremen and port captains, had no clue how to actually throw a dinner party. He adored that about her. He thought she completed him. Candace brought her daughter, Chloe, along with the deal. Chloe was 16 then, quiet, exceedingly polite, and she seemed to exist in a state of constant, robotic obedience to whatever Candace demanded. They moved in, Dad expanded the entire guest wing just for them, and life seemed fine. Every year after that, he took us all on the annual yacht trip. It was his prized tradition, started when I was 12, when he chartered a 38-footer for my birthday and actually let me steer for 20 minutes while he stood right behind me, his big hands covering mine on the wheel. Now, you need to know that Arthur Vance was a meticulous planner. He trusted exactly two people with the intimate details of his massive estate, me and Marcus Thorne, his attorney and best friend since before I was born. Dad died 3 years ago. Sudden heart attack right at his desk. He was working, as always, one hand still on a shipping manifest and the other holding a cup of coffee that was actually still warm when his secretary found him. The will reading was scheduled for the following Thursday in Marcus's austere downtown office. Candace sat across from him in a stunner of a black dress that she'd clearly bought just the day before. I knew it was brand new because she hadn't even noticed the price tag was still tucked inside the collar, poking out against her neck. Chloe was right beside her, ignoring everything, just scrolling intently on her phone. Marcus Thorne sat at the head of the dark mahogany conference table and read through the relevant provisions in the exact order my father had stipulated. My portion came first. I received the controlling interest in the logistics company, held within an irrevocable trust my father had established 10 years earlier, when he was only 53 and in perfect, robust health. The trust was managed by an independent trustee, Marcus himself, and it included airtight clauses for successor beneficiaries, specific charitable allocations, and what the legal documents called a spendthrift clause. That was crucial. It meant nobody, not me, not a creditor, not a court order, could pledge, sell, or legally transfer my interest to anyone else. It was untouchable. Candace's face was a mask as she waited for her turn. She received the right to occupy the mansion on Breer Point for as long as she wished. She was also granted a generous monthly stipend of $12,000, drawn from a completely separate, dedicated account my father had funded specifically for that purpose while he was alive. But that was it. She received nothing else. No lump sum, no percentage of the business, no seats on the board. Candace looked at Marcus Thorne with pure ice in her eyes. It was the look you give someone who has moved your living room furniture while you were sleeping. That's it, she asked, her voice tight and trembling slightly. Marcus calmly closed the thick manila folder. That is the entirety of the distribution, Mrs. Vance. Candace didn't burst into tears. She didn't scream or throw a fit. She stood up with terrifying calm, slowly straightened the hem of her expensive new dress, and silently walked out of the office. Chloe immediately got up and followed her mother, like a shadow. Neither of them said goodbye to Marcus or to me. Over the next 6 months, life at the Breer Point house became bizarre. Candace began aggressively redecorating. It was subtle moves, at first new curtains in the dining room, a different area rug in the foyer. But then the moves got aggressive. My childhood photos were taken down from the staircase wall and replaced with trendy abstract prints she ordered from some catalog. My late mother's watercolors, paintings my dad loved, were boxed up. The locks were changed on the wine cellar. Then, the locks were changed on the linen closet, for some reason. I didn't say a single word about any of it. My father had wanted her comfortable in that house, and I was going to honor his last wishes, even if it meant she bleached my past out of existence. By March, however, Candace upped the ante. She hired her own high-priced litigation attorney. I only found out because this new guy sent a formal, aggressive letter to Marcus Thorne. Marcus called me later that afternoon, his voice grim. He said only 3 words. "She's making moves, Mila." He explained the legal dynamic over the phone that evening. Candace's new attorney had filed a dynamic fishing expedition inquiry with the county probate office. They were laying the groundwork to challenge the entire irrevocable trust on grounds of undue influence. The claim was that my father hadn't been of sound mind and body when he established the trust a decade ago, and that I had somehow unduly pressured him into essentially disinheriting his devoted wife. The irony of the claim was almost hilarious. My father had created that specific trust 10 years before he died, during a massive boom in his business. It was during a period when he'd just passed a rigorous physical with flying colors, renewed his pilot's license for his private Cessna, and personally spearheaded and negotiated a 9-figure cargo contract with a massive European shipping consortium. The challenge Candace was making was totally meritless. It was a joke. Any judge in the state who took 5 minutes to look at the trust's creation date against my dad's medical and business records would dismiss it before they even went to lunch. I asked Marcus point-blank over the phone if we actually needed to worry about this. The legal structure of the trust itself is absolute ironclad, Marcus assured me. But Mila, I've been practicing law for 40 years. When greedy people run out of legal options, they start getting creative. I didn't fully grasp the weight of what he meant at the time. I was just focused on how pathetic the probate challenge was. But in the weeks that followed, Candace's entire demeanor shifted. She suddenly became warmer, almost maternal. She started cooking elaborate family dinners every single Sunday, roast chicken, potatoes, the works, always with a fresh salad drenched in that specific good olive oil from Connecticut. She genuinely suggested a girls' spa weekend for the three of us. She started calling me sweetheart when we crossed paths in the hallway, something she had literally never done in the history of our relationship. For 2 weeks straight, she personally brought me a cup of coffee every morning. Same specific mug, same time, same faux-loving smile plastered on her face. She'd set it on the counter, say, "Good morning, sweetheart," and then she would just wait. She'd watch me until I actually took a sip before she would leave the kitchen. I noticed the radical shift in behavior, of course, but I honestly just thought she was finally accepting reality. Maybe she realized the lawsuit was a dead end and was trying to bridge the gap. Looking back now, with the clarity that almost dying gives you, I should have seen the pattern. I should have recognized what she was actually doing. Every single act of forced warmth, every cup of coffee, every sweetheart was a calculation. It was a measurement. Candace was analyzing exactly how much goodwill and trust she needed to build up with me before she could afford to spend it all in one brutal afternoon. In late May, Candace casually pitched the idea of reviving the annual yacht trip. We hadn't done one since my father's funeral, for obvious reasons. She brought it up very gently, almost tentatively, over one of those Sunday roast chicken dinners. "It has been 3 long years since Arthur passed," she said, her voice soft and persuasive. "Let's finally do it right this time for him. Just the 3 of us, you, me, and Chloe. We need this for closure." I looked over at Chloe. She looked up from her plate and I saw something flash across her face for a split second. It wasn't quite fear, but it wasn't joy either. It was something. Whatever it was gone before I could even try to put a name to it. Despite my internal radar, I said yes. I didn't say yes because I trusted Candace. I said yes because my father had loved that specific tradition more than any other he kept, and I just wasn't ready to let that part of him die along with the company assets. I should have let it die. The morning of the trip, I threw a few essentials into a battered canvas bag. High SPF sunscreen, a thick novel I'd been meaning to finish since at least February, and most importantly, my father's old maritime compass. It was a rugged, solid brass Brunton he'd purchased back in 1989 from a retired merchant marine captain down in Galveston. The old captain had handed it to him and said, "Now listen, son, this thing will not tell you where you need to go, but it will always tell you which way you are already facing." My father had carried that heavy brass weight on every single major voyage he ever made after that day, and I had carried it in my jacket pocket every single day since the afternoon he died. At the marina, the luxury yacht was already sparkling and prepared for our departure. Candace had obviously arrived early to oversee things. She was standing on the dock, looking like a Millionaires Club advertisement in tailored white linen pants and a brand new, flashy gold watch I hadn't seen before, featuring a very thin, delicate band. That red cooler was sitting at her feet, packed full and buckled shut. 2 crew members were already working on the stern deck. I stopped dead when I saw them because I didn't recognize either of them. My father always used the same trusted crew. "Where is Captain Miller?" I asked, my voice showing a hint of concern. Captain Miller had run this boat for my dad for 20 years. "He's finally taking a much-needed vacation, honey," Candace said smoothly, not missing a beat. "I hired temporary replacements. They came highly recommended by the marina owner himself." The two crew members just nodded vaguely at me without actually introducing themselves or making eye contact. One was a stocky guy with a brutal sunburn. The other was tall and thin, wearing mirrored aviator sunglasses that totally reflected the entire dock behind me. Neither of them wore a uniform, and neither had a name tag. I stepped aboard. Chloe was already set up on the bow, lounge chair fully reclined, phone locked in her hands, frantically scrolling. She did not look up when I stepped on deck. She did not say good morning. The only acknowledgement I received from my stepsister was the very slight, tension-filled shift of her shoulders, that micro-adjustment a guilty or stressed person makes when they know they are being watched, but they refuse to be the first one to break the silence. The first hour of the trip was, honestly, totally unremarkable. We motored smoothly out of the sheltered harbor into the open waters along the coast. The sun was blazing high, the wind was just a light, pleasant breeze, and the water was unbelievably flat, so flat that you could actually see the reflection of the hull trailing behind us in the wake like a dark, wobbly shadow. Candace decided to pop the vintage Veuve Cliquot at 2 in the afternoon, pouring 3 generous glasses. She dramatically raised hers, offering a toast to family, she said, locking eyes with me. I drank my champagne. Chloe drank hers. The champagne was cold, crisp, and incredibly dry. I checked my dad's old brass compass once, just purely out of habit. The needle pointed unwavering to the north. Based on the coastline, we were heading south-southeast, moving steadily toward a stretch of gorgeous, secluded coves my father always used to anchor in for a quiet lunch. We finally dropped anchor around 6:30 p.m., but in a small cove I actually didn't recognize. It was beautiful but strange. Candace appeared from the cabin and poured the absolute last drop of champagne into a fresh glass. She carried it over to where I was standing, leaning against the stern rail, watching the sunset. It's a beautiful evening, she sighed, moving in close to me. She was so close that I could literally smell the rich brie cheese and vintage champagne on her breath. And then she leaned into my ear and whispered something I will never, ever forget as long as I live. Say hi to the sharks for me. Before the last horrifying word even fully left her lips, her hand slammed into the center of my back with explosive force. The solid stern rail didn't just give under my weight. A railing is designed to bend and hold. This rail moved backward with me, completely loose. The bolts holding the main support post had been expertly loosened and then reattached with cheap hardware that was never meant to hold more than a few pounds of pressure. Candace hadn't just pushed me. She had designed the mechanism of my death. I went over the back of the boat, backwards. The water was not cold. That was the very first thought my rational mind registered as I plunged into the bay. It was warm. 74 degrees, my father would have noted immediately. He always prided himself on knowing the precise temperature of any body of water within 2 degrees just by looking at it. The second thing I registered, the moment my head broke the surface, was the roaring sound of the yacht's powerful engine accelerating, kicking up a huge rooster tail of water. They weren't turning around to get me. I surfaced, coughing. The salt water burned my eyes like acid. The stern of the family yacht was already 30 yards away and rapidly pulling farther out into the open bay. I looked up through the spray, and I could see my stepsister, Chloe, standing at the stern rail, looking straight down at the churning water where I had been just moments ago. She didn't move. She didn't reach for a life ring. She didn't scream for the crew. Chloe just calmly turned around, walked inside the warm, safe cabin, and closed the heavy glass door behind her, sealing me out. The yacht's wake hit me, rocking me violently twice, and then the open water flattened again. Just me and the ocean. I was utterly alone. My shoes were heavy, immediately waterlogged. I kicked them off, watching them sink down into the murky green darkness. My phone was in my back pocket, obviously ruined the instant I hit the water, now just dead weight. But my father's solid brass compass was in my front jeans pocket. It was heavy, yes, real brass, real glass, and a needle that had been pointing north since 1989. For some reason, I refused to let it go. I kept it. I trod water for a few minutes, analyzing my situation. I looked toward the distant shore. I could see the faint coastline, a dark, jagged line with a few scattered lights starting to twinkle as evening hit. Maybe 2 miles away, maybe a little less. My father had taught me how to swim in that very harbor when I was only 5 years old. He always told me that the daughter of a captain who cannot swim isn't just a shame, she's a liability, and he refused to raise a liability. I took a deep breath, oriented myself toward the shoreline, and started swimming. I'd been swimming for maybe 20 minutes, focusing on my breathing, when the first cramp hit me. My left calf turned into a knot of agonizing pain. I couldn't swim through it. I immediately rolled onto my back and focused on floating, waiting for the muscle to release, fighting down the panic. The sky above me was bleeding from vibrant orange into a deep, bruised purple. The first prominent stars were just showing. Floating there, I thought about my father. I thought about how a man as meticulous as Arthur Vance would have checked those rail bolts himself before every single trip, with his own wrench, because that was simply the kind of man he was. He never trusted life to chance. I thought about Candace's whispered goodbye. I thought about Chloe closing that cabin door. And then I saw moving lights. Not fixed shore lights, lights moving low on the water. A commercial fishing trawler. A deep, powerful voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "You in the water, do not move. Stay right where you are." It was Captain Dale Buchanan. He was 71 years old, a decorated Vietnam veteran, and he personally pulled me aboard his vessel with a blunt boat hook and a grip that felt like it could have bent solid rebar. He hauled me onto the deck and looked me over. "You fall off a party boat or something?" he asked, not unkindly. "Something like that," I choked out, shivering. Dale Buchanan didn't ask many questions. He didn't pry. He immediately handed me a scratchy, old wool blanket that smelled powerfully of diesel fuel and raw fish, poured steaming coffee from a battered thermos into a rugged steel mug, and pointed me toward a metal bench bolted to the deck near the wheelhouse. His trawler wasn't comfortable in the least. It was a serious working boat, messy nets stacked on the stern, significant rust spots on the cleats, a VHF radio crackling with constant static in the cabin. But it was solid, it was floating, and it was above the water line. And right then, that was more than enough. "You hurt," he barked from the wheelhouse door. "No." "You want to call someone?" "Yes," I said immediately. "I need to call someone." He handed me his satellite phone. It was heavy, outdated, the size of a brick, and it had a thick rubber antenna. I didn't call the police. I dialed Marcus Thorne's direct office line. He answered on the very first ring, which told me he was still sitting at his desk at 9 o'clock on a Sunday evening. That told me absolutely nothing about Marcus had changed in 34 years. "Mila," he said, sounding surprised to get a call from a number he didn't know. "Marcus, I am alive," I said, my voice shaking. "Candace pushed me off the yacht." Complete silence on the other end of the line. A 5-second pause. For a high-priced attorney like Marcus Thorne, who bills his time in rigorous 6-minute increments, 5 seconds of total silence is a long, expensive time. "Where are you exactly?" he finally said, his voice deadly serious now. I looked up at Captain Dale. Dale glanced at his GPS display and rattled off the precise coordinates. I repeated them to Marcus. Marcus repeated them back to verify. "Do not call anyone else, Mila," Marcus commanded, his attorney voice fully activated. "Not the local police, not Candace, and absolutely do not call Chloe. Understood." "Why?" I need to tell them. "Because right now, at this exact moment, Candace Vance fully believes you are at the bottom of the ocean. She thinks you are dead. If she believes you are dead, she is going to start making moves, Mila. She is going to file fraudulent claims. She's going to contact her new lawyer. She's going to try to access whatever estate assets she thinks she can lay her greedy hands on now that you're gone. And every single move she makes in the next 48 hours will be documented, time-stamped evidence of actual criminal intent." I understood immediately. My father had trusted Marcus Thorne for a very good reason. The man saw the entire chessboard, not just the pieces. "Give me 48 hours, Marcus said grimly. "I will have everything we need to bury her." I hung up the phone and looked at Captain Dale. He was leaning against the wheelhouse door, arms crossed over his chest, not even pretending he hadn't heard every single word of my conversation. "Someone tried to hurt you," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. "Yes." "Well then, you need to be invisible for a couple of days." 2 days, he nodded, processing this. "I spent 14 months invisible in a jungle outside Da Nang, young lady. 2 days on a commercial fishing boat. That's nothing. You're safe here." He went back into his wheelhouse without another word. I sat on that bench, clutching the oily blanket around my shoulders, my father's brass compass clutched tightly in my hand. The brass was actually warm from being in my pocket. The needle was steady. I held that compass. I watched the distant coastline lights twinkle, and I did not sleep for a very long time that night. What I am about to tell you next is what Marcus Thorne relayed to me 48 hours later, after his private forensic accountant and his retired lead investigator had finished documenting every single move Candace Vance made while she believed I was fish food at the bottom of the ocean. The resulting timeline was precise. Marcus, just like my father, worshipped precision. At 7:00 in the morning, the day after I went overboard, exactly 12 hours after I hit the water, Candace finally called the U.S. Coast Guard to report me missing at sea. 12 full hours. She waited half a day before calling in a rescue. At 7:42 a.m., barely 40 minutes after notifying the authorities, Candace was on the phone with her attorney, Pritchard. At 9:15 a.m., Pritchard filed an emergency petition with the county probate court, seeking to preserve estate assets on behalf of Candace Vance, listing her as the sole surviving next of kin. At 11:30 a.m., Candace called the life insurance company. This was only the first of 3 separate calls she would make to them that single day. See, there were 3 substantial life insurance policies naming Candace Vance as the beneficiary. These weren't policies my father had taken out. These were separate, aggressive policies Candace had taken out on me over the past 14 months, utilizing her position as a household member to access my personal data for the applications. The total combined payout if I was legally declared dead, $4.2 million. $2 of those policies were less than 6 months old. At 2:00 p.m., a locksmith arrived at the mansion on Breer Point. Candace personally had him drill out and change the lock on my father's private study, the only room that contained the physical original copies of certain trust documents and files she desperately knew about. At 4:10 p.m., Chloe Vance made a public post on social media. "Please pray for my sister, Mila. We are devastated." It was the very first time in 16 years that Chloe had ever publicly referred to me as her sister. Marcus Thorne had a forensic accountant actively tracing the origin of those insurance policies, and a retired police investigator documenting the locksmith's visit. The attorney's emergency court filings, and the blatant timeline of the Coast Guard report delay. Every single action Candace Vance took during those 48 hours was photographed, logged, and timestamped. By the second morning, Candace had successfully filed 2 of the 3 insurance claims, pushed her emergency probate petition, and changed every single lock in the mansion, except, bizarrely, the main front door. I can only suspect she left that one unchanged because she didn't think anyone relevant would be coming through it anymore. Marcus called Captain Dale's satellite phone at sunrise on that second day. I was sitting on Dale's trawler, drinking coffee from that same rugged steel mug, wearing the same borrowed, fishy clothes, watching a pelican execute a perfect landing on the bow rail. "She has given us everything we need, Mila," Marcus said, his voice surprisingly light. "It's time to come home." I thanked Captain Dale profusely. He brushed it off. "You do not need to thank me, kid. Just make sure whoever did this to you doesn't get away with it." I looked him in the eye and told him I would. Dale dropped me off at a working harbor town 40 minutes south of my home. Marcus didn't leave anything to chance. He had already sent a private car to wait for me. A sleek, black luxury sedan driven by a silent, focused man who did not introduce himself and did not ask a single question about where I had been or why I smelled like a fishing trawler. Marcus Thorne's people were always exactly like that, terrifyingly efficient and completely incurious. During the short drive back to Breer Point, Marcus called me twice. The first call was an official update on the insurance situation. His forensic accountant had indeed confirmed that Candace had taken out 3 separate, aggressive life insurance policies on me over the past 14 months. She used her position in the household to illegally access my personal identification information for the applications. 2 of the policies were less than 6 months old. That dynamic alone, multiple recent high-value policies taken out by someone who attempts to kill you, is a massive red flag pattern that any federal prosecutor would recognize as textbook murder-for-profit motive, Marcus stated clinically. The second call, however, was significantly worse. Marcus's investigator had dug up something I didn't even know existed. Candace had been having secret meetings with a second high-priced attorney, not the first guy, Pritchard, for over a year. This second lawyer specialized specifically in high-stakes trust litigation. The probate challenge they had filed months earlier, the one Marcus had dismissed as trash, that was just the surface play. It was a distraction. Beneath that, Candace had been diligently preparing a forged codicil to my father's last will and testament. This forged codicil would have officially added Candace Vance as a co-beneficiary of the irrevocable trust, entitling her to a full 50% of all its massive distributions immediately upon my death. It was cleverly backdated to 18 months before my father died, notarized by a compliant third party, and witnessed by 2 people whose names Marcus didn't even recognize. It was poorly executed, though. Candace is not a maritime history buff, apparently, Marcus chuckled darkly. The notarization date on the forged codicil directly conflicts with your father's extensive travel records. He was actually in Rotterdam on the very date the codicil was supposedly signed by him in Connecticut. But she did it, Mila. And the original forgery was filed in a locked drawer in her attorney's office, just waiting for the right moment to be discovered. The right moment was the exact moment I was legally declared dead. I sat in the plush back seat of the sedan, watching the familiar New England highway blur past in the early morning light. My dad's heavy brass compass sat right on the leather center console, catching the glow from the sunrise. The words of that old merchant captain down in Galveston echoed in my head. It will always tell you which way you are already facing. Marcus Thorne proceeded to outline the brutal plan for my arrival. I was not to contact the police first. First, I would execute a devastating surprise. I would walk into the house while Candace was physically present, and I would walk in with Marcus, armed with all the evidence and right in front of a neutral witness. Your Uncle Martin will be there, Marcus stated. Uncle Martin was my father's older brother. He arrived at the house early this morning to offer his condolences to the grieving widow. And who else? I asked. Martin, me, and you, Mila, Marcus said firmly. That is enough. 3 adult witnesses to her reaction. 3 is more than enough for court. The majestic mansion on Breer Point looked exactly the same from the main road. The beautiful white clapboard siding, the dark shutters, and that gorgeous, sweeping wraparound porch that my father had built during the summer I turned 14. He built it only because my mother had always wanted a traditional New England porch, and he'd never actually gotten around to building it while she was alive, which was his greatest regret. But from the driveway, I immediately spotted 2 glaring changes that made my stomach lurch. First, the comfortable old porch furniture was gone. Candace had replaced my mother's classic wicker set with some awful, modern, gray minimalist crap. And secondly, my mother's favorite rocking chair, the one that had sat in that exact same prime spot on the porch for 22 years, was gone. The white paint on its armrests was chipped where she used to grip it while watching my father's tugs come into the harbor. Now, in its place, was a pretentious potted plant. Marcus Thorne's luxury car was already parked in the driveway. He had intentionally arrived an hour earlier to get Uncle Martin into the room. I got out of my sedan. I was still wearing the outfit borrowed from Captain Dale Buchanan, an enormous, scratchy red flannel shirt that was at least 2 sizes too large, and a pair of heavy-duty work jeans cinched at the waist not with a belt, but with a length of rough dockline because Dale didn't own a belt that fit me. My hair was matted, stiff with dried salt and sweat. I hadn't showered in 2 days. I walked straight up to the massive front door. I didn't knock and I didn't ring the bell. This was my house. I used my secret second key, the one key Candace Vance didn't know I owned. The one my father had personally pressed into my hand when I turned 21, saying, "Mila, keep this one somewhere she will never look. You trust me on this." At 21, I had just assumed he was paranoid about burglars. Now, at 25, I finally understood who he was really worried about. The front door opened with a familiar creak. The grand hallway immediately smelled like aged cedar. My father's private coat closet, the one closet Candace hadn't dared to touch because she said the smell was too painful for her. That was, ironically, the one honest thing she had ever said about my father. I walked through the hallway and stopped at the living room doorway. Uncle Martin was sitting awkwardly on the sofa, clutching a lukewarm coffee cup. He saw me first. The cup stopped moving hallway to his mouth. He didn't put it down, and he didn't stand up. He just locked his eyes on me with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror I have never seen on a grown man's face. Martin Vance looked like he was watching a person walk out of a grave they were definitely supposed to be in. Candace was sitting nearby, mid-sentence, talking to Martin in her practiced, grieving widow tone about the upcoming memorial arrangements. "Flowers," she was saying, discussing white lilies. She started to turn toward Martin's frozen gaze, her mouth still forming the word lilies. She saw me standing in the doorway. She saw me in a dead man's flannel shirt, my hair caked with salt, my hand gripping my father's heavy brass compass. Candace Vance's mouth just closed. She didn't say my name. Nobody spoke for approximately 7 full seconds. I actually counted them in my head, the way my father used to count the seconds between a lightning flash and a thunderclap, not out of a need for precision, but just for something concrete to hold on to while the storm was raging around you. Uncle Martin finally set his coffee cup down on the end table, but his hand was shaking so badly, the ceramic made a loud, resonant click against the expensive wood. Chloe suddenly appeared at the very top of the grand staircase. She saw me, stopped dead on the 4th step, and her hand immediately went to the rich railing, gripping it until her knuckles were white. I walked across the living room to my father's favorite oversized armchair. The one chair Candace hadn't been able to move because it was constructed of solid oak and weighed nearly 140 pounds, too heavy for her to lift alone. I sat down in it. Marcus Thorne entered the room calmly from the dining area, carrying a thick manila envelope. "Candace," I said, pitching my voice low and steady, "I understand you have been remarkably busy while I was gone." Marcus opened the envelope and placed legal documents down on the dark coffee table one by one. He did it with the same calm precision my father used when laying out complex navigation charts, unfurling the map, understanding that every single line drawn on that page had irreversible real-world consequences. "The first document," Marcus announced, "is a set of 3 substantial life insurance policies taken out by Candace Vance over the past 14 months, listing herself as sole beneficiary. The total payout upon Mila's death was to be $4.2 million. Note that 2 of these policies are less than 6 months old. The second document is Candace Vance's emergency petition, filed with the county court just 4 hours after reporting Mila missing, actively seeking legal control over all Vance estate assets as the sole surviving next of kin. The third document is a forged codicil to Arthur Vance's last will, backdated 18 months, attempting to add Candace Vance as a co-beneficiary of the irrevocable trust. The notarization date, however, directly conflicts with extensive maritime travel records, proving Arthur Vance was physically in Rotterdam on the day the codicil was supposedly signed by him in this house. The fourth document, of course, is the official Coast Guard incident report. Time of incident, approximately 7 p.m. Time of the very first call from this household, 7 a.m. the following morning. A significant and convenient 12-hour gap. Marcus placed his high-end fountain pen on the table beside the stack of documents and dramatically clicked it closed. "Mrs. Vance," Marcus Thorne said, his voice flat and clinical, "the specific trust your late husband established 10 years ago is legally irrevocable, and more importantly, it contains a robust spendthrift provision. This means that even if Mila had died on that yacht, the control and assets of the Vance estate would have immediately transferred to the Arthur Vance Maritime Foundation, a charitable trust. Those assets would not transfer to you, nor to anyone else in this room. Your entirety of motive was based on a fundamental ignorance of the law. He paused, letting the crushing reality of his words sink in. The life insurance claims you have filed in the last 48 hours are fraudulent. The backdated codicil is a forgery, and the Coast Guard has officially been notified of your unexplainable 12-hour delay in reporting a man overboard emergency. This timeline is not an accusation, Mrs. Vance. It is a confession written by your own greedy actions. Candace Vance's face didn't show the anger I expected. It didn't show fear or sadness. It showed something far worse. Her expression was that of a person who suddenly realizes they have completely and utterly destroyed their entire life, their security, and their future, all for something they were never, ever going to get in the first place. Uncle Martin Vance looked at Candace, then he looked down at the damning evidence on the table. He didn't pick up his coffee again. Chloe, still on the staircase, was crying, but it wasn't sad. It was hysterically quiet. She hadn't moved a muscle from the fourth step. Marcus Thorne calmly slid the forged codicil across the mahogany table toward Candace. "You can keep this copy, Candace," he offered with a polite, terrifying smile. "We have the physical original in our possession now." If you have ever sat across a room from someone who has been smiling to your face and calling you sweetheart for months while actively planning to take everything you owned and leave you for dead, you know exactly what that specific moment felt like. The pure, electric tension. But the real difference between me and a lot of people in that situation is that I had a father who actually planned ahead. He built a fortune, but he also built walls around it that couldn't be forged or broken. But not everyone is that lucky. Not everyone gets a second chance. So if this story is right now reminding you of some greedy, backstabbing person in your life, someone who is just waiting for their moment, do yourself a favor and take a breath. Protect yourself. And if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button, because this next part is where things really and truly unravel for Candace Vance. The next 40 minutes at the mansion on Breer Point produced exactly 14 phone calls. I know the precise number because Marcus logged every single one of them. At 3:14 p.m., Uncle Martin Vance walked out of the room, picked up his phone, and called his wife, Carol. He told her what had happened. Even from across the living room, I could hear Carol's sharp voice shrieking over the line. She said one explicit word, paused, and then shrieked it again, much louder. At 3:22 p.m., Carol apparently called Candace's sister in Pennsylvania. I don't know exactly what was said on that call, but it lasted 9 long minutes. At 3:31 p.m., Candace's sister called Candace's cell phone, which was sitting on the end table. Candace did not answer. She was still sitting in the exact same chair, staring at the documents spread across the coffee table, as if she hoped they might rearrange themselves into a story that didn't end with her in handcuffs. At 3:45 p.m., Candace finally picked up her phone and made a single call to her original lawyer, Pritchard. That entire conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Whatever Pritchard told her, and I imagine it was some variation of "you are on your own." Candace silently hung up the phone and set it face down on the armrest. At 3:52 p.m., Chloe, who was still paralyzed on the staircase, sent me a text message. I felt my borrowed prepaid phone, the one Marcus had given me in the car, vibrate in my pocket. Somehow Chloe had gotten the number. The text was simple. "Mila, I did not know about the insurance policies. I swear on my life I did not know she was trying to get money out of it." I didn't reply. At 4:03 p.m., Uncle Martin called his daughter in Boston. At 4:09 p.m., Martin's daughter called Garrett Vance's former business partner. At 4:14 p.m., that same business partner called Marcus Thorne's cell phone. Marcus just glanced at the caller ID, smiled, and let it go straight to voicemail because he was too busy standing in my living room, watching an entire dynamic of a family disintegrate in real time. Candace finally stood up at 4, 18 p.m. She did not say a word to anyone. She walked straight to my father's locked study, opened the door with the new key she had forced the locksmith to provide, stepped inside, and locked the heavy door behind her, sealing herself in with the one handset thing she had left. The loud, resonant sound of the heavy study door slamming shut was the only loud noise made in the mansion that entire afternoon. Uncle Martin immediately turned to me. "Mila, did you already call the police?" "Not yet," Marcus stated firmly, intervening. "The police involvement will happen, Martin. But first, I need Candace's attorney to physically arrive at this location so that every single conversation and disclosure is fully witnessed and documented. This isn't about simple revenge, Martin. This is about ensuring that every single piece of evidence is handled in a way that a federal district attorney can successfully use in a multi-count felony prosecution." I sat in my father's favorite armchair, closed my eyes, and just listened to the giant mansion fill up with phone calls and dynamic silences. The armchair was, honestly, the only piece of furniture in the entire living room that was exactly where my father had left it the day he died. Candace Vance had moved literally everything else: the rugs, the lamps, the side tables. But she had not moved this chair. She couldn't. It was designed of heavy, solid oak, and it weighed 140 pounds. She literally could not lift it by herself. My father, Arthur Vance, always did build things to last. Chloe finally came all the way downstairs 20 minutes later, but she didn't walk into the living room. She sat down on the very bottom step of the grand staircase, which placed her physically in the grand hallway with a clear view of the living room, but strategically outside of what she perceived as its perimeter, as if she had not yet made the internal decision whether she belonged inside or outside of the explosion that was currently happening. Her eyes were bloodshot and red from crying. She was aggressively picking at the edge of the carpet on the step, pulling at a loose fiber with her thumbnail, the same way she always did when she was 19, and Candace was yelling at her about something trivial. I had seen that exact, anxious gesture 100 times. It was the learned gesture of someone who had practiced making herself very, very small. "I knew about the yacht trip, Mila," she said. She was looking intently down at the carpet fiber, not at me. "She told me about it, that morning, the morning of, but she told me we were just going to scare you, Mila. Scare you enough that you would agree to do the right thing and modify the trust." She paused, her breath hitching. She said it would be like aggressive negotiation. You would be frightened, out on the water, and you would finally just agree to sign papers that gave her a larger, fair share of the estate. And then, she said, we would come back and everything would just be normal again. Chloe stopped again, picking harder at the carpet. "Mila, I did not know she had messed with the railing. I did not know about the insurance." I let her speak. I didn't interrupt. Marcus Thorne was still standing by the dining room doorway, not writing anything down, but simply listening with that specialized, eerie stillness that only veteran attorneys possess, a stillness that records everything. "When you went over the side, Mila," Chloe said, her voice trembling, "my mother," she just grabbed me. She forced me to go below deck. She kept saying over and over that it was just an accident. She said you would swim to shore. She said you grew up on these docks and that people swim to shore out here all the time. I just looked at her. "And when you went below deck, Chloe," I stated flatly, "is that when you poured yourself a celebratory glass of champagne?" Chloe finally looked up at me for the first time. Her face wasn't defiant, but it wasn't apologetic either. It was the haunted face of someone who had just heard the absolute truest, most brutal sentence ever spoken about them and didn't have a single word of defense. "I know," she whispered. I didn't forgive her. I was nowhere near ready for that, and I was honestly not sure I would ever be. But I looked at her sitting there on the bottom step, aggressively picking at the carpet fiber. She was 34 years old, and she was still sitting exactly where her mother had told her to sit. I looked at my stepsister, and I said the only thing I could possibly say to her. "You are 34 years old, Chloe. At some point in your life, my mother told me to stops being a valid explanation for your choices." Chloe nodded slowly. She didn't argue. She didn't offer an excuse. She just slowly got up and walked back upstairs. That was the beginning of something significant for Chloe Vance. I didn't know what it was, but it was officially the very first time I had ever seen her nod at me without looking at Candace Vance first for approval. The dynamic changed at 4:47 p.m. Pritchard arrived. He was driving a polished silver sedan and carried an expensive leather briefcase with his monogrammed initials on the polished clasp. Pritchard was the kind of sophisticated attorney who looked like he had been born wearing a three-piece suit. He walked straight through the front door of my house without knocking, a seemingly small detail, but one that told me Candace Vance had obviously given him his own copy of the new key at some point during the past year. That specific detail, for some reason, bothered me more than almost anything else. He walked into the living room and saw me first. Then he saw Marcus Thorne standing by the dining room door. Then he saw the damning manila envelope and the stack of documents still spread across the coffee table. Pritchard's face did something complex, shifting in a split second. It wasn't surprise, exactly. It was a devastating recalculation. It was the stunned expression of a man who had been diligently building a dynamic legal case for 14 months and had just watched the entire foundation crack and collapse in a single second. "Mr. Pritchard," Marcus Thorne said, his voice deadly calm, "I believe you and I need to have a very serious, private conversation." The two attorneys stepped into the dining room. Marcus shut the heavy door behind them. I sat in my father's solid oak armchair. Martin Vance sat silently on the sofa. Neither of us said a word. But through the thick dining room wall, I could clearly hear Marcus Thorne's voice. He wasn't yelling. His voice was low, steady, with the absolute cadence of a man simply reading a list of facts. He was presenting the evidence package, the 3 life insurance policies, the forged codicil, and the devastating notarization via travel records discrepancy. After 12 agonizing minutes, the dining room door opened. Pritchard walked out alone. Pritchard didn't even look at me or Uncle Martin. He moved with this sudden, frantic energy across the hardwood floor and headed straight for the study. He gave a sharp, clipped knock, and Candace let him in immediately. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, but the walls weren't thick enough to drown out what came next. We could hear their voices rising. Candace's voice was high, sharp, that screechy tone she got when she was losing control of a room. Pritchard's voice was a low, urgent murmur. Whatever legal reality check he was giving her, she was clearly trying to fight it. 10 minutes later, Pritchard emerged from the study alone. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. He walked straight over to Marcus. "My client is willing to discuss a private settlement to resolve this quietly," he said, trying to regain some professional dignity. Marcus didn't even blink. He didn't even look up from his notes. "There is absolutely nothing to settle, Mr. Pritchard. Insurance fraud and the forgery of a testamentary document are criminal felonies. We aren't the ones who decide the resolution here. The district attorney is." Pritchard looked at me, then he looked at the front door like it was an escape hatch. He snatched up his briefcase. "Good evening," he muttered to the air, and he walked out without looking back. We heard his car roar to life in the driveway, his headlights sweeping across the living room windows like a searchlight before fading away. He was gone. He jumped ship. Uncle Martin turned to me, stunned. Did he just leave her high and dry?" "Yep," I said, not missing a beat. "Without so much as a good luck to Candace. He's gone." Martin leaned back into the sofa cushions and rubbed his face with both hands, looking exhausted. "Your father always did say Candace had champagne taste in everything except her legal counsel." It was the first thing that had made me even close to smiling in 3 days. 6 minutes after her lawyer bilayed, Candace finally stepped out of the study. She stood in the doorway with her chin tilted up and her shoulders back, that classic Vance matriarch pose she used when she wanted the world to think she wasn't terrified. But I could see her hands. They were trembling violently at her sides. They were the only honest part of her left. She looked directly at me and said something I never expected to hear. "Your father chose you over me every single day for 18 years, Mila. Even from the grave, he's still choosing you." She didn't try to deny it anymore. She didn't offer some fake, tearful apology. She just stood there in the frame of my father's study, surrounded by his massive collection of maritime law books. shelves she had never once bothered to touch in nearly 2 decades, and she finally spit out the truth she'd been harboring. "I spent 18 years in this house," she hissed, "and I was never allowed to actually asterisk on a single thing in it. Not a painting on the wall, not a bank account, not even the right to use the Vance name without someone subtly reminding me that it belonged to him first." Martin shifted uncomfortably on the sofa, but stayed quiet. "I was 40 years old when I married Arthur," Candace continued, her voice trembling with resentment. "I was just an event planner from Bridgeport who spent my life decorating parties for people who actually mattered. I walked into this mansion and I thought, finally, I am someone. I am somewhere. And then he died, and I realized I was just a guest. I was always just a guest in his eyes. I just listened. I didn't jump in, not because she deserved the floor, but because I wanted to hear the twisted logic people use to justify pushing someone into the dark ocean. I wanted to see the monster without the mask." She finally finished her rant and waited, as if she expected me to argue or defend my dad. I just stood up slowly. "Candace, I get that you felt like you had nothing, but the truth is, you had a massive monthly stipend, you had a multi-million-dollar roof over your head. And you had a stepdaughter who kept your lights on and your life funded simply because her father asked her to." I paused, letting the silence get heavy. "What you didn't have was asterisk enough, but for people like you, enough is a moving target. You were never going to be satisfied." I watched her process that. I watched the realization hit her that this wasn't the start of a negotiation. It was the finality of an ending. Martin stared at the floor, still clutching that cold coffee cup like a lifeline. The house fell into a deafening silence. Through the large bay window behind Candace, I could see the harbor. The first few evening lights were beginning to flicker on over the water. I started counting them without even thinking about it, a habit I'd picked up from my dad. He always counted the harbor lights at dusk because it told him exactly how many of his boats were still out on the water. 7 lights, all of them accounted for. I turned to Marcus and gave him the nod. "Proceed." Marcus didn't hesitate. He stepped into the dining room and made 3 phone calls with the door wide open. He wanted us to hear every single syllable, and he definitely wanted Candace to hear them. The first call was to his senior paralegal. He gave direct instructions to prepare a formal criminal referral to the district attorney's office for the following morning. 3 counts of insurance fraud, 1 count of felony forgery, 1 count of reckless endangerment. The second call was to the trust administration head at the bank that managed Candace's monthly stipend. Marcus cited a material breach of the good faith clause and directed the bank to freeze all distributions effective immediately. He explained, quite clearly, that attempted physical harm to the sole beneficiary qualified as a material breach under any sane legal interpretation of the document. The third call was to a local property management firm. Marcus requested a formal, legal 30-day notice to vacate, addressed to Candace Vance, for the residence at Breer Point. With each call, another layer of her life was stripped away. Candace sat on the very edge of the sofa, listening to her world shrink into nothing with every sentence Marcus spoke. Money, home, status gone in 3 calls and 9 minutes. After the calls were done, Martin came over to me. He stood by the window, watching the harbor lights. "Your father would have handled this exactly the same way, Mila," he said softly. "My father wouldn't have had to," I replied. Martin just nodded. He put on his coat and walked out. He'd done what he came to do, he bore witness. And in a family like ours, that's everything. I spent the next hour walking through the house alone. I walked through the dining room Candace had redecorated with curtains I hated. I walked through the kitchen where she'd played the doting mother for 2 weeks with a smile that never reached her eyes. Then, I went out the back door to the garage. My mother's rocking chair was tucked away in the back, hidden behind the snowblower under a dusty green tarp. There was grit on the seat and cobwebs across the armrests where that white paint was chipped. I ripped the tarp off. I carried that chair back through the house, through the kitchen, through the grand hallway, and out onto the porch. I set it down in the exact spot where it had sat for 22 years. It wasn't some big, dramatic, cinematic gesture. It was just putting the world back where it belonged. I sat down, The old floorboards creaked under the runners, a familiar, comforting sound. The salt air rolled off the harbor. My dad's compass was still in my pocket, but I didn't need to take it out. I already knew exactly which way I was facing. Over the next 3 days, my phone blew up more than it had in the last 3 years combined. My Aunt Marjorie called first from New Hampshire. She hadn't even stepped foot in the house since the funeral. "I never trusted that woman for a second," she barked, the kind of thing people say after the fact when it costs them nothing to be right. But then she added, "I'm sorry I wasn't paying closer attention, Mila." That part felt real. I accepted it. Candace's brother called on day 2. He was screaming, full of misplaced rage, telling me I was framing his sister and that she'd never hurt a fly. He told me I should be ashamed of myself. I let him rant for exactly 30 seconds before I hung up. Some people aren't worth the data it takes to host the call. The actual yacht captain, Captain Miller, the one Candace had sidelined for the trip, contacted Marcus directly. He told us Candace had canceled his services 3 days before we were supposed to leave, claiming she'd hired a private specialty crew for a smaller excursion. He'd been the Vance captain for 11 years and had never been replaced once. He was more than willing to testify. Marcus informed me that the 2 crew members Candace had hired had already fled the state. No employment records, no captain's licenses on file. They'd been paid in untraceable cash. Marcus's investigator eventually tracked one of them to a marina in South Carolina, where he was working under a fake name. The other one had vanished into thin air. "Legitimate maritime crew don't get paid in cash and then disappear into the night," Marcus noted. By the 3rd day, a local paper ran a small blurb about a maritime heiress incident. I didn't even read past the headline. Marcus handled the press with a 2-sentence, no comment, and a request for privacy. I finally went back to the office, my father's company. The operations floor went dead silent the moment I walked in. People looked at me, then back at their monitors, then back at me, whispering. My operations manager, Decker, a guy who'd been with my dad since I was in high school, walked up to my desk. "We heard the news, Mila," he said simply. "What do you need from us?" "I need the quarterly logistics report on my desk by Thursday morning," I said. Decker looked at me with the same expression Captain Dale had on the trawler, the look of someone who had decided to respect your way of surviving without asking too many questions. "Thursday," he nodded. "You'll have it." The 30-day notice period passed like a slow-moving storm, sometimes fast, sometimes dragging, but always moving forward. Candace packed. She didn't ask for a hand, and nobody offered one. She moved through the rooms with cardboard boxes and packing tape, methodically dismantling 18 years of being Mrs. Arthur Vance. Every evening when I came home from work, I'd see the stacks of boxes in the guest wing. They were all labeled in Candace's perfect, elegant handwriting, the penmanship of a woman who spent her life writing names on place cards for tables she didn't own. She took the stuff you'd expect, her designer clothes, the jewelry my dad had bought her, the novels on her nightstand. But she also took things that caught me off guard. She took the crystal champagne glasses from the yacht. She took the olive jar from the cooler. She even took the guest towels she'd monogrammed with a W when she first moved in. She was stripping away the symbols of a life she had curated, like a stagehand striking a set after the play has been canceled. On day 12, Chloe came to find me. I was in my father's study, going over trust distributions with Marcus on speakerphone. Chloe knocked and waited until I waved her inside. "I'm moving out today," she said quietly. "I found a studio apartment in the city." I set the phone down. "Is it your mother's place?" "No, it's mine. I found it on Monday." That was a huge deal. In 34 years, Chloe had never lived a single day in a place that Candace hadn't hand-picked for her. "I'm going to get a job," she added. "A real one." She held out her phone. On the screen was a digital portfolio, graphic design work, sleek logos, brand identities, high-end packaging. The work was clean, sharp, and confident, everything Chloe herself had never been allowed to be. "My mother never let me show this to anyone," she whispered. "She told me Vance women didn't need to work. She said it was beneath us." I looked through the portfolio. It wasn't just okay, it was actually great. The branding pieces had a clarity and logic to them that honestly reminded me of my father's navigation charts. Everything had a purpose. "This is strong work, Chloe," I said honestly. "If you're applying, lead with the branding pieces." She looked at me, lingering, waiting for something more. Maybe a hug, maybe total forgiveness. I didn't have that in me. Not yet. But I gave her a professional, honest assessment. That was the only bridge I was willing to build. She'd have to be the one to cross it. On day 28, the last of the boxes were gone from the hallway. Candace walked through the empty guest suite one last time. I wasn't home when she finally left for good. I stayed late at the office, reviewing the numbers Decker had delivered right on time. Some goodbyes are just better if they never happen. Marcus called me on a Tuesday morning while I was at my desk. "The DA has officially reviewed the evidence," he said. "Charges are being filed. 3 counts of insurance fraud, 1 count of forgery, and reckless endangerment." The attempted murder charge, Marcus explained, was going to be an uphill battle. The physical evidence of the railing being tampered with was technically circumstantial. The bolts were definitely swapped, but proving Candace herself turned the wrench was hard without the 2 missing crew members. "But the reckless endangerment charge is heavy," Marcus said. "Combined with the insurance fraud and the forged codicil, the picture is undeniable." Captain Dale Buchanan provided a rock-solid written statement to the district attorney. His testimony about finding me in open water, my physical state, the timeline, and the total lack of any distress signal from the yacht corroborated every single word of my story. The arraignment was on a Thursday. Candace pleaded not guilty. I didn't go. I read about it in the local paper the next morning over a cup of coffee. The article was short, just 4 paragraphs about a maritime estate dispute. It didn't mention the sharks. Candace's world continued to collapse in on itself. Her high-priced lawyer withdrew because she couldn't pay him. Her family split down the middle. Her brother still made excuses for her, but her sister in Pennsylvania stopped taking her calls entirely. She was stuck in a cramped rental on the bad side of town, burning through savings that wouldn't last a year without that monthly stipend. Marcus and I spoke one last time that week. He said something my dad would have said. "We've charted the course, Mila. Now we just let the current do the rest." My dad never trusted the current, I reminded him. He always kept a hand on the wheel. Marcus was quiet for a second. "Your father was a cautious man, but he also knew when to stop steering and just let the vessel settle. You've done the hard part. Let the law do its job now." I put the phone down and looked at the brass compass on my desk. The needle pointed north, as always. I slipped it into my pocket and got back to work. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place 3 weeks before the trial. Marcus's investigator finally tracked down the notary who had stamped that forged codicil. She was only 26, living in a small town 40 minutes inland. Candace had paid her $2,000 in cash to notarize a document the girl knew hadn't been signed by Arthur Vance. The notary flipped immediately. In exchange for a plea deal, she gave the DA everything. Text messages from Candace setting up the meeting, photos of the cash on her kitchen table, and the nail in the coffin, an audio recording she'd secretly made on her phone during the transaction, just in case. On the tape, Candace could be heard telling the girl it was just a formality and that the family was all on board. She believed that $2,000 would buy her a lifetime of silence. She was wrong. That evidence was the end of Candace's defense. The fact that the forgery was created 6 months before the yacht trip proved she had been planning this entire sequence for half a year. The warmth, the Sunday dinners, the coffee, the sweetheart comments, it was all just scaffolding for a murder she'd been building since the leaves changed color. Marcus called the following week. "There's a plea deal on the table. Her public defender is begging her to take it." "What's the offer?" I asked. 5 to 8 years for the fraud and forgery. Reckless endangerment served concurrently. She'd probably be out in 4 with good behavior. Is that fair? Marcus took a long time to answer. Fair would be her actually understanding that she tried to kill a person for money she was never going to get. I don't think any prison sentence teaches that kind of soul-searching. Candace took the deal on a Wednesday morning. I found out at lunch. I finished my sandwich, called Marcus to say thanks, and went back to my meetings. Some things don't need a celebration, they just need to be over. The sentencing was quick. 5 years. Eligible for parole in 3. I didn't attend, but Uncle Martin did. He called me from the courthouse parking lot afterward, sounding older than I'd ever heard him. "She looked small, Mila," he said. I didn't ask him to explain. I knew. Candace Vance was a woman who lived for the room. Without the mansion, the name, and the designer labels, she was just a 58-year-old woman who had made a choice she could never take back. "Thanks for being there, Uncle Martin," I said. "Someone from the family had to be," he replied, "even for this." I sat at my desk for a long time after that call. I didn't feel joy or some massive relief. It was more like that specific emptiness you feel when you've been carrying a heavy pack for miles, and you finally take it off. Your back still feels the weight even though it's gone. I worked until 7 p.m. By 6, the office was a ghost town. I finished my last report, killed the desk lamp, and drove home. The mansion was finally quiet. No Candace in the kitchen, no Chloe lurking on the stairs, no fake smiles, just the smell of cedar from my father's closet. I sat on the porch in my mother's rocking chair. I counted the harbor lights. 9, 10, all present. My phone rang. It was Chloe. "I got the job, Mila," she said, her voice sounding stronger. "At a design firm in Portland. I start Monday." "Congratulations," I said. "Remember, lead with the branding." "I know I don't owe you anything, Mila. I know that." "Good luck in Portland, Chloe," I said. I meant it. Not with a hug, but with the factual honesty my father would have used. Some bridges are built on nothing more than the acknowledgement that the person on the other side is capable of crossing. 6 months later, I officially activated the *Arthur Vance Maritime Foundation ***. It wasn't legally required. The trust would have done it if I had died. But I did it because I finally understood why my father had built it. The foundation now funds advanced maritime safety training for commercial fishing crews, survival protocols, emergency navigation, the works. It's the difference between a captain coming home or a family getting a phone call. The very first scholarship was named after Captain Dale Buchanan. He showed up to the ceremony in his only suit, navy blue, a little too big in the shoulders. He shook my hand with that same iron grip that had hauled me out of the Atlantic. "Your father and I never met," Dale said, "but I have a feeling we would have gotten along." "He would have asked you about your boat first," I laughed. Later that week, I went to the cemetery. Arthur Vance, beloved father, Captain. The headstone was simple granite. No fancy anchors, just one line he chose himself: "Leave the dock clean." I placed his brass compass on the stone for a moment, then I picked it back up. I wasn't done with it yet. On the drive back, I passed the marina. The yacht was still there. I hadn't sold it, but I hadn't touched it either. The stern rail had been replaced with military-grade hardware, inspected twice. Someday I'll take it out again, when the water feels like my father's water again. Tonight, I'm back on the porch. The harbor is spread out below me, just like it was for my mother and my father. I opened the compass. The needle swung, hesitated, and settled due north. My dad said a compass doesn't tell you where to go. It tells you which way you're already facing. He wasn't talking about boats. He was talking about knowing who you are before the world tries to tell you otherwise. I closed the compass and put it in my pocket. Someday soon, I'll pack that old red cooler myself. No champagne, no brie, just ham sandwiches and root beer, the way it's supposed to be. The harbor lights came on one by one. 7, 8, 9, 10, all on, none missing. I listened to the creak of the rocking chair and the sound of the tide against the docks. I didn't count anything else. There was nothing left to count. Thanks for sticking around for this one. If Mila's story reminded you that being prepared is the best defense, or if you've got someone in your life who's always had your back, tell me about it in the comments. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Check the description for more stories of people who refuse to disappear. I'll see you in the next one.